Hi. Ignore this, and ignore the fact that there's nothing on the axe, even though I was chopping up somebody or something. We're gonna put that right here. We're gonna put that right here for the rest of the video. Although I can also grab this. It's very shiny, it's very big. Well. Am I in focus? Pretty sure I'm in focus. Okay, so this video is not going to be similar to what I've done before. It's going to be a first of a kind. I'm going to be doing an Iceberg video. Specifically, I'm going to be doing a video that I've been wanting to do for years, literally before I even started this YouTube channel. And I have so much energy right now that I apologize in advance if the voiceover sounds like I just woke up, because in a lot of cases I did just wake up making that voiceover. Push that to the side from now, I'll apologize for it later. I'm dressed up like a mad scientist because I am talking about Universal horror. All of Universal horror, but from the classic era. Yes, some of you might not give a shit. A lot of us being me for sure, give a shit about Universal horror. Excuse my language, it's not very postcode whatever that we're going to be getting into with this. But yes, today we're going to be talking about the Universal Classic Horror Collection. That is basically everything before the 70s, which I consider the modern age. That's when we get Jaws, that's when we get a lot of other things. We're just going to be talking about the 60s and back, although you'll see in some things on this iceberg, there will be very late 60s. Nothing after the 60s, but just very late 60s. A good majority of this I've been wanting to do for a while, and it just so happens to be that every time I look online and I look for videos and I look for lists and complete that of Universal horror, I can only ever really find people talking about the main 8 mainstream horror movies. These bad boys. They're usually talking about these bad boys. All those bad boys right there out of focus. That's usually what people are talking about. It's just 8. And for people that go a little bit deeper into it, they talk about the Phantom of the Opera and the Hunchback from the 20s, which is also really cool. And if they go deeper than that, they talk about Metaluna mutants and mole people, which is great in my opinion. However, it's never really past that. And I was like, hey, there's 30 of these. There are 30 of these. There's 30 of these films. There's 30 of these films. A good majority of them don't matter, but they matter, if that makes sense. And although 30 is quite a bit more than the average person knows when it comes to Universal monsters and horror, it's still not everything. So what do I mean? What do I mean by the ultimate horror collection? Well, it's not a complete horror collection because unfortunately Lost Media makes that a little bit impossible for us, but it is an ultimate horror collection. We're going to be talking about 90-ish films here. And again, aside from like the Frankenstein and all those of the 30 movies that they have with all their sequels and the Abbott and Costello stuff and whatever, we're also talking about stuff like Tarantula. We're talking about like mole people. Yes, This Island Earth with the Metaluna mutants, but we're also going to be talking about more stuff that I don't want to get into because I'm going to get into it in a second. We're also going to be getting into some rights territory, so properties that Universal maybe did not make or produce, but they own, and since they own it, they do distribute it now, or at least it's a very big part of their like legacy and what they put out today. But yes, I've been trying to do this video for a very long time, as I've already mentioned, and I wasn't really sure how to go about it. For a long time I was just kind of bouncing around the idea of, oh, I know I want to make this video, I know it's going to be really long, but how? And I feel like the iceberg is a very popular trend right now, and I feel like it's the easiest way to digest this. We're just going to go from the tippity top with like the more well-known mainstream stuff, and then we're going to go all the way down into like the lesser known stuff that some people might already know, but some might not. And I feel like that iceberg list chain works the best, at least for this type of video that we're making. I've seen nobody go into excruciatingly painful details of how some of these movies were like made, conceptualized, and whatever. Well, some of these I will go into detail, and I'll have some anecdotes here and there. Some of these other ones, to just like keep it from being a 3-hour-long video, I'm just gonna be like, yeah, this was a movie, it existed, whatever. And then other ones I'll be like, yeah, it was directed by so-and-so, it was fun, it was, you know, this. Where it matters, I will kind of put an emphasis on each of those films, especially in this first tier, but I'm still going to include every movie that I have found or researched, and I have gone through the trouble of just researching all of this and just getting to like the nitty gritty, even if I talk about one movie for 2 sentences and I talk about another movie for like 3 paragraphs. So we got 6 tiers, and I've also got an honorable mention section all the way at the end. This is just a little bonus. I'm gonna put little time codes down here for like where everything is in case you just want to skip to certain things, or you know, I know how I watch Iceberg videos. I'll just watch like 30 minutes on a drive and then like 30 minutes on a lunch break or something like that. People break them down in portions. You can do that for this. Absolutely. I'm not expecting everybody to sit here for the entire like hour-long duration of this video. I mean, I'm rambling already. So here are these time codes again so that you can just go to each tier. And we're going to start with like the mainstream stuff and go down into like the better-known sequels, and then like the cheesy B-movie ripoff stuff, and then the lesser-known things, and the silent era stuff, and the things that are out of date. They're kind of like, you know, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and all the way down into the lesser-known stuff until we get to the honorable mentions. So I'm gonna shut up, and we're gonna get to it now. I promise. Side note, I might have recorded some footage of me as the Invisible Man to overlay on top of stuff if I feel like it's a little too boring, although most people are watching an Iceberg video to listen, not exactly watch. But I wanted to make this video visually appealing as well as just informative, so there might be footage of me as the Invisible Man, like, you know, this, that, whatever. Alright, enough of me rambling. We're just gonna get straight into the Iceberg tier, so I'm gonna pull over at this imaginary lever. We're gonna get on to tier 1. I'm gonna do my mad scientist stuff, so be warned. Alright, we're getting into tier 1. This is pretty much the mainstream of the mainstream, although I have added some other films that, yes, they are incredibly popular and influential and whatnot. Matter of the fact is, most people don't actually know it's Universal horror anything, and we're getting into this. We're going through the horror, the thriller, the crime, the sci-fi. Everything that encompasses Universal horror is in this Iceberg, and in this first tier, we're definitely going to see the mainstream ones, included some very popular ones that are Universal properties now and deserve to be in this ultimate collection. So, this is tier 1. Dracula 1931.
I am Dracula.
This is the first of the mainstream Universal monsters starring Bela Lugosi. This is the most iconic portrayal of Bram Stoker's creation, but is also based on the 1924 stage play. The film is a large part of why the monster movies gathered so much success, and I recommend watching it on a rainy day. Lugosi established a cultural icon Todd Browning directed, and today it is preserved in the Library of Congress.
Dracula.
Frankenstein, 1931.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
James Whale's first film of 3 in the Monsters catalog, the second Universal Monsters film in the mainstream eye, and one of the most successful and iconic monsters ever. Adapted from both the 1818 novel by Mary Shelley and the 1927 play by Peggy Webling, this film turns Frankenstein, his monster, and the number of cliches into beloved staples of classic horror. Watch the movie for yourself. There's much to talk about it, but for now, just acknowledging the strengths of James Whale and his directorial legacy in this collection of horror is unmatched.
Shut off the light!
The Mummy, 1932. Personally, I'm not a fan of Universal's Mummy films because they've always fallen flat for me, but Boris Karloff is nothing but amazing in his role as the Mummy, and without this initial film and subsequent sequels, there wouldn't be the more colorful Hammer Mummy films and eventually Universal's great Mummy film of 1999. Truth be told, despite the lackluster plot of the film, aesthetic and vibes alone make it a cozy movie to put on during a marathon, even if it's just in the background. The Invisible Man, 1933.
You don't know what you're doing.
One of my favorites from the classic Monsters line, and yet another preserved film in the Library of Congress, also made by James Whale, starring Claude Rains, who gives a maniacal performance as a scientist going mad. The special effects of the time were insane to even think about, let alone do practically in 1933, but they managed, and I consider this an extremely fun film. Though the pacing of most older films can differ, a good majority are paced well, and The Invisible Man is one of those fast-paced films, where our tragic lead deals with moral dilemmas and does everything for the love of his life. Please watch this film, it's great.
Crazy to know who I am, aren't you?
Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. A sequel to the already historically significant Frankenstein, James Whale and some cast return again for Bride of Frankenstein, and this is one of extremely few cases where the classic horror sequels of this time period is not only great, but excels beyond the original. And Bride of Frankenstein was Whale's best film, and watching the first plus this film makes for an excellent double feature. It's worth mentioning that James Whale was an openly gay man in the 20s and 30s directing films, and in Bride of Frankenstein you really get to see and feel a lot of the subtext and underlying messages of prejudice and how it was to be different in society through the characters in the film, such as the monster.
But I can't leave them, I can't. Yes, go. You live.
James Whale created a wonderful successor that once again is preserved in the Library of Congress. The Wolfman, 1941. The most popular of werewolf films from Universal, but it's not the first, and to me, is about as exciting as The Mummy. But with more impact than The Mummy, especially later on in the monster legacy of films, the Wolfman is portrayed by Lon Chaney Jr., son of Lon Chaney, who played many famous monsters in the early silent film era. I only wish this movie didn't drag as much as it did, though later adaptations with this character would have fixed these problems at times. The Phantom of the Opera, 1925. Speaking of Lon Chaney, this is perhaps the most well-known Phantom of the Opera film to people who think of Universal horror monsters, or black and white films, or even silent films. The imagery that was Lon Chaney and his special effects makeup for the Phantom, as well as the legacy of everything this film from 1925 has given us, has lasted into the subconscious of film for a long time. It's sad to say that this isn't the version most DVD and Blu-ray collections carry, because this film exists in the public domain, and can be found anywhere in the public domain movie collection. The double-edged sword is that accessibility and not having a proper release is unfortunate, but people still think of this film as compared to the usual version that is released in collections, and to that all I can say is that it is a truly timeless film, no dialogue needed. Creature from the Black Lagoon, 1954. Okay, what can I say about this film? It's my favorite Universal monster film. It's my favorite Universal monster. And this is the perfect film in my eyes when recommending a classic black and white horror because it has everything. The pacing is good, the action is there, the story and themes are fun, the cinematography is amazing. There's so much to love about Creature, and to this day, there has only ever been 3 movies total since the 1950s that have ever had the creature be the main monster. It's unfortunate that the best Universal monster film has had nothing in decades. However, that can also explain how it's so fresh, even years into the future, that without any new media since the 50s, it has remained relevant, iconic, and deserving of the praise. I recently saw the 3D version of Creature back in May of 2023 and had an amazing time. And unfortunately, Rico Browning passed away this year as well in 2023. He was the last surviving Universal Monsters actor and actresses, and I had the privilege of meeting him at my very first film festival where I screened my short film, at Spooky Empire 2018 in Orlando. I was glad to have been able to tell him I love the creature, and he was an amazing guy through and through. I was more than likely just another fan of his monster that he would have forgotten in due time, but regardless, to me, in a day and age where films like this are lost to time for newer media, there was something so incredible about meeting a man who, decades before I was born, starred in a film I would love decades after being born, and getting the privilege to meet and tell him that. Rest in peace, Rico Browning. I will always love the creature from the Black Lagoon, and I will always appreciate what the Universal monster films mean to me. Go watch this movie. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, 1943. A sequel to the Wolfman, and the first of all movie crossovers long before Freddy, Jason, aliens, predators, and superheroes, there was Universal Monsters. Lon Chaney Jr. plays the Wolfman, Bela Lugosi plays Frankenstein, and a pretty epic clash of monster against monster unfolds. Reviews didn't really hold up this film, but the impact of the film led into more crossovers to be had and changed the landscape once again for film, creating a cinematic universe like no other. Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, 1948.
Somebody else coming after me?
First of the Universal monsters to collab with comedians Abbott and Costello, this is perhaps the best of their collaborations, and includes Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, and a slight cameo from the Invisible Man. This horror comedy genuinely has good laughs, and was preserved in Library of Congress, funny enough. Abbott and Costello meet the Mummy, 1955. Abbott and Costello collaborate in a horror comedy with The Mummy, and this would also happen to be the 28th and final Abbott and Costello film made by Universal International, The Incredible Shrinking Man, 1957. Okay, now this is the first movie on the list that isn't a recognizable Universal monster. It's not even a monster movie, it's a sci-fi, but it's also fairly horrific, especially in concept. The Incredible Shrinking Man is deserving of its place amongst the Universal horror collection for many reasons, primarily the fact that it's a terrific Universal movie in general. You can find the Criterion Blu-ray of it with essays and bonus material right now in stores. It's so high on the list because the legacy of this sci-fi has been seen so much in the film industry, from forced perspective and props to very similar movies like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Even if you've never watched this movie, you know the cliches or story, and for that reason alone, it is iconic and high on the iceberg, as well as considerably a part of this horror collection. King Kong, 1933. This is a technical Universal monster movie, though it was produced by RKO Pictures. Considering multiple rights issues and legal battles, King Kong today is a Universal property and, in spirit, is a Universal monster all these years later. To go into specifics would be a total dissection of what King Kong has been through in this near century, especially when we consider RKO Pictures' 1933 film and sequel, Son of Kong, also from 1933, have a Warner Brothers distribution, which falls in line with the Monster vs. Kong movies from the last couple of years. But we'll have another confusing distribution from Universal and another movie duology we'll cover in a bit. Psycho, 1960. Again, this is another technical Universal horror made by Alfred Hitchcock. Though distributed by Paramount Pictures, Universal has subsequently made every sequel, remake, and TV media since, as well as currently distributing the original film as well. So this places Psycho as one of our couple of weird legal rights movies that Universal has when we consider the scope of their classic Universal horror collection. Welcome to Tier 2. Alright, it's getting a little too hot over here. It's too much lightning, too many things. I'm gonna keep the gloves on though. Still look like a mad scientist. Tier 2. On to Tier 2. This is where we get into like the better known sequels and the better known sci-fi and horror movies that aren't sequels at all. Now, some of you might be asking, why is this movie on this and there's other movies lower in the iceberg that I know? Well, there's 2 points to that. One, if you know it, that doesn't mean the audience knows it. Basically, if the fourth movie has more pop culture significance or more references and cliches and tropes that people would understand as compared to the cookie cutter second sequel, I'm going to have that one higher on the iceberg and that second one lower on the iceberg just because of cultural significance. The second point relates to that, in which, yes, I made this iceberg, so I'm kind of organizing these movies not necessarily by any like chronological means, but simply due to the fact that, well, some of it just has more pop culture significance than others, and so they deserve to be higher on this list, and not everything can go into Tier 2 of the iceberg. But yes, on to Tier 2. The Hunchback of Notre, 1923. We enter this part of the iceberg with yet another iconic Lon Chaney film, this one being regarded by many keen horror film fans as the first in the line in the Universal Monsters, though later we'll learn it's just the one that's more recognizable in niche silent film era horror movies aside from Phantom of the Opera, 1925. Even still, Quasimodo the Hunchback's impact on pop culture continues to be forgotten outside of stuff like Disney's animated film, or the usual Hunchback stereotype, which usually goes by the name of Igor, which is just a misinterpretation of many horror cliches forming the caricature of a hunchback named Igor. It's unfortunate that Quasimodo isn't normally included in Universal monster collections alongside the likes of Dracula, Frankenstein, the Phantom, and more, especially since to many horror fanatics, his film is the first in Universal Monsters line. The film also happens to be in the public domain, so just like the silent film of Phantom from 25, this silent Hunchback film from 23 is mostly recognizable by those who go looking for this media and learning about film history rather than just mainstream audiences. All in all, this film is still well received and has had its own lasting legacy, so we celebrate the Hunchback of Notre Dame's 100th birthday this year as it becomes yet another century-old piece of film history. Phantom of the Opera, 1943. Now, this is the version most Universal collections have when talking about the Phantom of the Opera, and to my knowledge, this is the only Universal monster film ever filmed in color, which gives it a very eerie vibe comparatively. Granted, I like this version of the Phantom of the Opera, and I've watched it many times. I recommend it to all who haven't seen any Phantom movies, and I highly recommend it when talking about Universal horror because it's fairly creepy, especially towards the end. Tarantula, 1955. Directed by Jack Arnold, this is quite the sci-fi horror that is recognizable among the likes of aliens and gothic monsters, the big science experiment animal. I will say, although most modern mainstream audiences have probably never seen the original film, the cliche is so overdone all these decades later that we know how the film goes. Tarantula isn't the first big monster movie, it's not even the first big insect movie because Them 1954 predates it. But the giant spider is one of the most iconic cliche monsters ever, from movies to shows to video games, and Tarantula was a box office hit. There's even a giant tarantula done better in The Incredible Shrinking Man 2 years later because this film set the stage for that to happen. Before Monsters Cafe at Universal Studios Orlando was unfortunately taken down, you could often find the tarantula memorabilia and such decorating a section of the cafe, with the movie trailer playing above customers' heads. In fact, as a quick aside, I fell in love with the Monsters Cafe the moment I walked into it, and the entire place was just decorated with pieces of movie scripts, screen-accurate props, and more from all these classic monster movies. A big reason as to the conception of this video is because the Monsters Cafe wasn't just showing the usual 8 big baddies, they were showing so much more, from a lot more films. The whole cafe was a love letter to Universal Monsters, and because I spent so much time inside, it would often lead me to wondering if people could recognize any monsters outside the mainstream ones that were decorating the walls. Thus, a reason for this video was brewed, and Tarantula is the first Universal monster film I think of when I think of Monsters Cafe, alongside sitting near the movie's decorations and having the corny trailer play while I would eat my amusement park food. Play this film around Halloween to accompany your usual black and white movie marathons. I guarantee you it will add to the experience. The Man Who Laughs, 1928. This film is more of a romantic drama, but the main reason it deserves a place among Universal horror is Conrad Velt's iconic portrayal of Gwynplaine, who would go on to inspire the Joker in DC Comics due to the extremely horrifying face makeup and effects. For the time, it would also be considered morbid and gruesome, even though it's surely tame comparatively to other films on the list, but the legacy of this film led into more of the Universal Monsters' influence when it came to makeup, and again, inspiring an extremely recognizable fictional villain. The Mole People, 1956. This sci-fi adventure horror is another one with a bigger legacy than the movie can be remembered for. It's based loosely on Hollow Earth theories and depicts underground civilizations of scary mole people. You can find it a lot of times in home media releases of Universal horror sets, and personally, I think the movie is a decently fun watch. Strangely enough, the first time I ever recognized the Mole People as a Universal monster was because of the 2012 Universal Monsters online multiplayer battle arena game. This is a project I wish Universal never abandoned in the same year and would love to see come back because it opened my eyes when I was younger to the expansive world of Universal Monsters and had a super large roster of characters and concept art that ultimately also inspired me to make this video because as a kid, it made me aware of the Mole People's connection to this grander horror universe. Plus, with the gaming industry as it is now, it would be the best time to have a Universal Monsters Battle Arena multiplayer game and bring back all of these iconic characters. Revenge of the Creature, 1955. A 3D sequel to a 3D film where the creature, also known as the Gill Man, is captured, put into an oceanarium tank in Florida, and escapes. That's really it. King Kong vs. Godzilla, 1963. We're circling back to King Kong plus Godzilla now, as for a certainty that if 1933's King Kong is RKO and Warner's child, and Universal only has visitation rights, then King Kong vs. Godzilla that Toho made in 1962 is definitely Universal's child as well, which released in American theaters in 1963. Not to mention, though it's not on the Iceberg, King Kong Escapes from 1967 getting American releases in 1968 make it not only another Universal King Kong film, but the most recent Universal monster film to date from the classic era. Both of these films put Kong, Godzilla, and other big bad kaiju on the list for Universal's collection. Dracula, Spanish, 1931. This is the lesser known but perhaps superior version of 1931's Dracula, and most of the reason is because this is the only example of these films I could find where two separate versions of a Universal monster movie were filmed concurrently, with this Spanish version being right after the American cast and crew filmed. They used the same sets, were aware of what was being portrayed, and took liberties without doing the American version, as well as being a much more gruesome film for the early 30s. It was released in Cuba in 1931 and was forgotten outside of film historians, and is recognized by a lot of fans as the best version of 1931 Dracula. This shouldn't take away from Lugosi's iconic portrayal, but Carlos Villarreal creates an even more sinister Count Dracula, and the Spanish version is now usually available alongside the American. This Island Earth 1955. Not normally considered when talking about Universal monsters because the Metaluna mutants of the film don't play such a big role, but for one, they still have an extremely iconic design, and two, this classic sci-fi movie is yet another in very, very tiny fraction of movies that was made in Technicolor, which makes it stand out. Now, I said Phantom of the Opera 1943 was the only monster film made in color, and it is, because movies like This Island Earth are rarely ever considered Universal monster films, understandably so. However, it does not take away from the fact that the mutants are still monsters that Universal created and occasionally recognize. On top of that, Phantom might be the only monster movie in color for Universal, but that makes this Iceberg so much more important when we start talking about lesser known entries and technicalities that then add more flavor to the pot. This Island Earth, King Kong vs. Godzilla, and King Kong Escapes show that flavor. Son of Frankenstein 1939. A lesser quality sequel to the Frankenstein name in my opinion, where Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi once again work together, and this would be where the character of Igor is essentially introduced to the mainstream world, cementing the name with the image of a hunchback servant, although Bela Lugosi's Igor never even had a hunchback, just a crooked neck from a failed hanging, and he was also a blacksmith, he wasn't a servant. So in retrospective, again, the concept of Igor is truthfully a Frankenstein of itself, pieced together by many parts of classic monster movies. Anyways, it had positive reviews, but not many sequels after Bride do it for me. They're all mostly just alright. The Cat and the Canary 1927. This is a silent-era horror comedy by German expressionist filmmaker Paul Lenny. It's part of a genre of horror comedies based on 1920s Broadway stage plays, and this film specifically can be recognized for paving the way for Universal's School of Horror. It was a box office hit that later got remade a couple of times after. Tower of London 1939. This is a historical film about a real King Richard III of England and a fictional executioner named Mord. This film is just that. It's a historical piece and fairly rewatchable. On to Tier 3, where we get into sequels and movies that are still known, but, obviously we're in this iceberg. Anything past Tier 1 is fairly unrecognizable to mainstream audiences outside of horror fanatics, and that's how I would say it is. Mainstream horror fans, horror fanatics that know their stuff, until we get to Tier 4. And it should be worth mentioning that I'm sorry at this point if we don't actually have HD footage or media or trailers. We're getting to a point in the iceberg where, unfortunately, because of lost media and time does what time does, it becomes harder and harder to find stuff to put into this video, even if I wanted to make it as aesthetically pleasing to the viewer as possible. I'm not a wizard or a time traveler, so I can't just go back and grab these pieces of media. I tried my best, but if you do see grainy footage or a little low quality footage or, just movie trailers and very short stuff, I'm going to try to make it as entertaining as possible. I'm going to try to explain with my voiceover as well as possible to keep everybody engaged, but yeah, that's just a little forewarning. It becomes a lot harder to find the media I need for this video because stuff just becomes so niche and obscure. I did try my best though, and pretty much everything except for 1 or 2 films later on has media for it, so I can do that. On to Tier 3.
It's all you! The creature walks among us, more terrifying in human form!
The Creature Walks Among Us, 1956. This is, for many fans familiar with the monsters flicks and sequels, the end of Universal monster films. This is definitely a melancholy film where the disfigured creature is turned into a humanoid who has an existential crisis and just wants to go back to the ocean. It's not great by any means, but it is fairly sad. The Invisible Man Returns, 1940. This is the second film in the Invisible Man series, though nothing special outside of the special effects winning an Oscar because, truthfully, The Invisible Man series is just full of wonderful special effects by many talented crew members working behind the scenes. Dracula's Daughter, 1936. This is the first of many Dracula sequels, and this one, which starred his daughter Countess Maria Zaleska, played by Gloria Holden, and is apparently based on a deleted chapter from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. It was well received, and critics were said to have observed some alleged lesbian overtones, which wouldn't be out of the norm considering Universal's record of having monster movies which have very diverse human qualities to them. The Invisible Woman, 1940. This movie is a fun one. It's directed by A. Edward Sutherland and starring Virginia Bruce. While practically all of the films on this list are some form of horror movie, funny or not, this movie is just a sci-fi comedy, with practically no horror and just all laughs. It's honestly a good time and was a breath of fresh air in a list mostly suspense and madness. Though maybe an outlier for sure, I think it fits into the cinematic universe that is Universal Monsters. Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man, 1951. This film exists, it's alright, but not as memorable or niche as the other Abbott and Costello films within the Universal Monsters legacy. I will probably give this a rewatch at some point to either cement that opinion or have it change. Werewolf of London, 1935. As I mentioned, Wolfman was not the first werewolf film made by Universal. This one was, and surprisingly, it's overshadowed by The Wolfman in that regard. In fact, when talking about werewolf media, this is the first feature-length werewolf film we know of, predating the rest at least. So it's strange how it's not talked about more often. Before Lon Chaney Jr., there was Henry Hull as a werewolf, and the film itself was a flop, but still regarded as a good film. And the craziest part about this film is that it was Werewolf in London, 1935, which inspired potentially the most well-known werewolf film ever made, An American Werewolf in London from 1981. The Thing from Another World, 1951. Again, we're going into rights territories, and again, Universal and RKO Pictures are the players. Seemingly, most RKO films have some sort of connection to Universal anytime the subject of a well-known film is brought up, and similarly to King Kong, Universal distributed The Thing 1982 and its prequel, The Thing 2011. And in 2023, you can find all three of these films together, distributed by Universal Pictures, even though they did not produce the film. Even still, this film inspired many, including John Carpenter, who made his own version of the film based on the novella Who Goes There in 1982, and the premise of a research base overtaken by a monster has forever been cemented in cinematic history thanks to Howard Hawks' film. It Came from Outer Space, 1953. This sci-fi horror that continues my favorite trope of titling a movie with pronouns such as it, they, them, and more, It Came from Outer Space is another atomic age horror movie where aliens are the center of the film, and it does it well. This movie also had the 3D trope, and it's a pretty good popcorn flick, I'd say. Jack Arnold is also directing this one, and the film received a made-for-TV sequel called It Came from Outer Space 2, so you know it's lackluster. This movie's shape-shifting aliens just want to fix their ship and leave Earth, so they're pretty chill, and makes these monsters one of few we can actually say aren't here to invade or kill, but in fact need human help. It's the human fear of the unknown that truly shows its ugly colors in this film. The Black Cat, 1934. Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi would star in this box office hit named after the Edgar Allan Poe short story. This film is responsible for popularizing psychological horror and was the first of eventually 8 films featuring 2 of the biggest actors in Universal horror. The Black Cat, 1941. Now, this is another Black Cat film inspired by Edgar Allan Poe's story yet again, and it also features Bela Lugosi, but it was a horror comedy that was well received enough back in the day. The Raven, 1935. Universal loves their Poe, and they love Karloff and Lugosi. This film would be yet another Poe-suggested film, starring the 2 actors, and unfortunately was poorly received, largely in part of the fact that the story had little to do with adapting Poe's classic at all. The Deadly Mantis, 1957. A sci-fi horror about a giant prehistoric praying mantis from a bygone era released from the North Pole due to iceberg shifting and attacks humanity after being freed from the ice. Yeah, it was considered a rip-off when it came out back in the day, but nowadays it has a very fun, campy quality that makes it worth checking out. Not to mention the enormous papier-mâché hydraulic mantis, which was 200 feet long and 40 feet high. I like big bug movies, so this one is recommended by me, even if there are better ones. The Old Dark House, 1932. James Whale directed this pre-code horror comedy, and it was a critical success, though being a lost film for some time before it was being rediscovered. A movie about 5 travelers seeking shelter from a storm in an old house where things go wrong. Definitely a classic made by Whale and starring Boris Karloff. Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1932. Based on Edgar Allan Poe's 1841 short story, this film is directed by Robert Florey and stars our favorite vampire Bela Lugosi. Only a bit of the original story stuck around and most of the writing was changed for Lugosi's role. The wide release received censorship because of the harshness of the time. The Last Warning, 1929. This was one of the very last silent films ever made by Universal in 1928, which also happened to be Paul Lenny's last film before he died of blood poisoning, getting released in January of 1929. It was both praised and called incoherent, but in 2016 it was selected for restoration by Universal, and it was a silly film with some damn good quality within the crew. Tier 4. We're really just getting into the nitty-gritty of the Universal horror collection because, at this point we're well past 30 films and we're still getting into some of the original Universal Monster sequels, but this is a lot more than most people ever really talk about. I will say though, although it's on the Iceberg, I guess I just forgot to write script for it or record voiceover it also. I'm going to mention The Cat Creeps, 1930. I put the little poster right here. Boop, 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 boop. This film is essentially a sound remake of The Cat and the Canary. And it's based on the same play of the same name of The Cat and the Canary. So I did forget to write and record that, so I'm just putting it up here. Yeah, on to Tier 4.
This way it can move unseen among its enemies.
Son of Dracula.
Son of Dracula, 1943. A Dracula film that stars Lon Chaney Jr. in yet another classic monster role. This isn't anything crazy. House of Frankenstein, 1944. A crossover film with Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, Dracula, Mad Doctor, and even the return of the Hunchback. It's an interesting flick critics didn't really like, but it was alright, and later had a sequel in a different house. House of Dracula, 1945. This is the sequel to House of Frankenstein with similar monsters returning and was, again, not favored by critics, but was originally going to be titled Wolfman vs. Dracula and was considered the last serious entry in the Frankenstein saga. The Ghost of Frankenstein, 1942. This is the 4th Frankenstein film with mixed reviews from critics. Lon Chaney Jr. stars in it, Bela Lugosi stars in it, Igor returns. At this point, the Frankenstein movies lost their charm for me, but it's always nice to have background noise in a gothic horror-sounding tone. The Mummy's Tomb, 1942. Lon Chaney Jr. plays the mummy in this one. That's dope. The critics agree, nothing special here. The only reason it's higher than most other sequels, even though not being the first sequel, is because A Mummy's Tomb is fairly recognizable. That's the answer here. The Mummy's Hand, 1940. This was the second Mummy movie made, and is another Mummy movie I can live without. It reuses scenes from the first movie and the entire score of Son of Frankenstein. I should probably reiterate at this point that even if I don't care for these movies, watching them and forming your own opinions is always the best option to do, regardless of what I think or say. That being said, this is the film that the 1999 Mummy remake closely resembles out of any of the classic Mummy films. So I guess that's something. The Invisible Man's Revenge, 1944. A return to form for the Invisible Man series, the effects and the story are closer to goodness of the original film than most of the other sequels in the series. Invisible Agent, 1942. This is more so war propaganda and less of a horror. I would skip over this, but there are some pretty cool visual effects as per usual with the Invisible Man movies. Abbott and Costello meet Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1953. Alright, notably, there is no Universal Jekyll and Hyde film predating this comedy duo crossover, which is weird, considering that normally what happened, Abbott and Costello would cross over with an already established monster. Though, Universal seemingly did not make a Jekyll and Hyde movie at all. The only one at the time was Paramount's 1931 film that really left a lasting legacy. However, we're going to come back to Universal and this classic monster story soon. For now, this comedy crossover exists in the same world as the duo meeting Frankenstein, the Mummy, etc., and this would be the only well-made Jekyll and Hyde anything at the time for Universal, because there was nothing predating it. For now. Man-Made Monster, 1941. Lon Chaney Jr.'s horror film debut, which is shamefully forgotten or looked over by most, considering this is the same actor who would play the most diverse array of Universal monsters out of any actor or actress. This film is a lot of fun, and it paved the way for Lon Chaney Jr.'s rise in Universal's films, even if he was a pain in the ass to be around according to multiple sources, but you know, that's most people back in the day. I feel like this film is a great piece of sci-fi spooky media to play around friends. The Invisible Ray, 1936. Starring Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, and others, this sci-fi horror was unique and entertaining according to most at the time, though it's dated. You've got a scientist who finds a meteorite with an element called radium X, and it makes the scientist glow in the dark, with a deadly touch going mad. This is essentially Man-Made Monster before Man-Made Monster was made. Night Monster, 1942. Bela Lugosi was in this one, but lead roles were played by Ralph Morgan, Irene Hervey, and Don Porter. Lugosi's name simply fills in the seats. The movie's set in a swampy small town plagued by murders and rumors. Oh, there's also a hunchback named Torque. The Climax, 1944. A Universal horror which states in the credits that it's based off of the 1909 play by Edward Locke, even though the plot doesn't reflect that. This movie was also supposed to be a sequel to the 1943 Phantom of the Opera, and the film stars Boris Karloff. The film was even made using the sets from the 43 Phantom film. This film was nominated for Best Art Direction. Black Friday 1940. Lugosi, Karloff, sci-fi horror, and execution. The funniest thing to me is that this movie's name was changed to Black Friday prior to filming, but was originally called Friday the 13th. No Jason Voorhees included. Night Key, 1937. This sci-fi crime film stars Karloff in yet another one of his dozens of starring roles for Universal, and the story is about the inventor of a burglar alarm getting back at a man who stole profits from his invention. The Mad Ghoul, 1943. This film is about a scientist and his assistant, and the scientist becomes obsessed with ancient Mayan life preservation, and he falls in love with the assistant's girlfriend, so he transforms his assistant into a zombie through these eternal life experiments. You got that? Good. It gets crazier. The assistant named Allison doesn't know he's undead, though he is slowly remembering his life. It's fun. It's interesting, I would say. Weird Woman, 1944. Noir mystery and horror with Lon Chaney Jr. A woman named Paula, played by Anne Gwynn, is brought to Reed's hometown, played by Chaney Jr. And stuff happens which leads locals to accuse the woman, of course, who believes in voodoo, of course, and Reed tries to find the real culprit. Evelyn Ankers played the movie's villain, and apparently, Ankers and Anne Gwynn would laugh anytime Ankers tried to be menacing, so Universal never hired her to be a villain again. The Mad Doctor of Market Street, 1941. A low-budget horror by Joseph H. Lewis about a mad doctor doing mad doctor things. The film released in 1942 as a double feature with The Wolfman. Horror Island, 1941. Horror mystery based on the short story Terror of the South Seas by Alex Gottlieb. Panama Pete, also called the Phantom, was played by Foy Van Dolsen, who seemingly doesn't have much to his name outside of 3 notable films. It's actually very hard to even find out who the guy was, or whether he has a Wikipedia page or not, because he just doesn't. It was considered a mediocre film, though. Tier 5. We're almost at the end. I don't really have to explain much for this tier. I mean, it's niche, it's obscure, and you probably already don't know about it. But we're getting into some territory where there's just stuff that, like, you know, barely exists anymore. Some stuff preserved. I'm gonna pull this lever now. The Mummy's Ghost, 1944. Another mummy movie I don't care much about, but it exists. Nothing personal. I will probably do a series retrospective on the entire Mummy series someday. The Mummy's Curse, 1944. Okay, this is the last of Lon Chaney Jr.'s mummy reign, though this time in the swamps of Louisiana. This film was not favored by critics such as myself. She-Wolf of London, 1946. This mystery horror film is about a young lady who has the blood of a werewolf running in her family, who is potentially responsible for a string of deaths in an early 20th century London. Critics were tired of these film plots by now, and granted, it makes sense, since the film wasn't anything special, but it has a nice noir film. The Leech Woman, 1960. To keen horror film fanatics, this can be considered the last in the classic Universal horror catalog, because after The Leech Woman, A new era of modern horror begins, and fresh films start appearing all over the 70s. We've mentioned that films such as Psycho and King Kong Escapes would count as technical Universal films. This truly was a Universal production, however, not skewed by rights issues in any ways, making it the last classic horror film for Universal Puritans. The plot is about a middle-aged woman trying to be young again, so she uses an ancient African potion to regain that youth, and it needs to be consistently used. So, the woman eventually kills men to steal their life for herself, and it was a pretty cool idea for the era, even if reviews were mixed, and it has a lot to say about sexism and ageism for a film in 1960. The Phantom Creeps, 1939. The first and only serial on this list, it stars Bela Lugosi in a 12-chapter mad scientist sci-fi horror. This was also Lugosi's final serial appearance. There's a lot of plot to cover, but for now I'll just mention that it was influential in creating the scrolling text synopsis starting each chapter, which would inspire yet another famous crawl, the Star Wars opening crawl. And Rob Zombie made a song called Meet the Creeper based on the movie. House of Horrors, 1946. A horror film about a madman named the Creeper, played by Rondo Hatton. Rondo would unfortunately die on February 2nd, 1946, before the movie's release on February 22nd, but was remembered for his facial features due to illness, which made him a legend in Hollywood horror. This film, along with some other Universal horror films, made Rondo a cult icon for future generations, and his legacy will forever be remembered by those who watch old black and white horror. The Strange Door, 1951. Starring Charles Lapton, Boris Karloff, and others, the horror film was based on Robert Louis Stevenson's short story, The Sire of Motroit's Door. Murder mobs, revenge. It's a black and white horror, alright. It was well received and violent back then. The Mystery of Edwin Drood, 1935. A melodrama directed by Stuart Walker based on the unfinished 1870 Charles Dickens novel. Claude Rains of Invisible Man fame is playing a character named John Jasper. David Manners played Edwin Drood, and it was his last film, because he didn't like movies. To him, they were parts and pieces of a story with no unity, while doing a play is to become a play from beginning to end. I can understand his points, and I know both theatrical and film acting has its differences, but I feel they both equally require the actor or actress to get creative, whether in bits or in full. Regardless, his points stand, and the film was mixed on release. Curse of the Undead, 1959. First of the horror western variety on this list, which was originally a gag idea by husband and wife team Edward and Mildred Dean, Universal liked it enough to greenlight a movie, and was intended as a satire of vampire theming in the Old West. A B-movie western horror that is worth a shot. I think it's cool. The Last Performance, 1929. This silent film about a sinister magician has a version with music and such, and can be found restored by the Criterion Collection as a bonus feature in the 1928 Lonesome Blu-ray and DVD from 2012. Strange Confession, 1945. Horror noir mystery with Lon Chaney Jr. and was later re-released as The Missing Head. It has its fans, I guess. The Frozen Ghost, 1945. Another Lon Chaney Jr. noir mystery with death and mystery involved. Captive Wild Woman, 1943. Okay, this movie is about a scientist experimenting on a female gorilla named Chila, turning Chila into a human named Paula by sex hormone injections and brain transplants. It received 2 sequels. Jungle Woman, 1944. The sequel to the batshit crazy Captive Wild Woman from 1943, where Dr. Carl Fletcher is in court because he murdered Paula the Ape Woman. But not really. This was considered among the worst of the Universal horror films. It still has a sequel. The Jungle Captive, 1945. The third film in the trilogy of the Chila the Ape Woman series. This was once described by an anonymous Fangoria reviewer as superior to Jungle Woman, but only in the way that 1 punctured lung is superior to 2. That is the end of the Chila the Ape Woman series. Pillow of Death, 1945. Another noir mystery horror, which was the last in a series called Inner Sanctum, which comprised 6 movies such as The Frozen Ghost and Strange Confession. Lon Chaney Jr. is in this one too, and there are some comic relief characters because the story is grim enough. Dead Man's Eyes, 1944. A noir mystery with Lon Chaney Jr. I'm not surprised. The Black Castle, 1952. A gothic horror film directed by Nathan H. Duran, with actors including Karloff and Lon Chaney Jr. This film was made in the US but premiered in Sweden. This film truly feels gothic and is a chilling, ghoulish tale. Calling Dr. Death, 1943. Alright, so I haven't shown much interest to the inner sanctum mysteries that star Lon Chaney Jr., but this film would happen to be the first of those mysteries, which needs me to dive deeper into it. After all these mystery, noir, and horror films under Inner Sanctum, it's worth mentioning that it originates with a popular radio series. Lon Chaney Jr. was in most of these films because he was looking for more diversity after being casted as monster after monster. He was hopeful, and it gives us some more insight into why there are 6 of these mystery noir films. I chose not to really dive deep into it until now, and frankly, like how the Mummy movies really aren't that interesting or groundbreaking to me, this series of films also just doesn't need too much elaboration, but are still worth mentioning when we want to talk about everything under the Universal Horror umbrella. And I'm sure that there are still fans, and maybe some of you might enjoy these films if you watch them. I will simply just dive into these titles at surface level if need be, and maybe make full-length videos just to talk about them as a whole in the future. Oy. The final tier. Tier 6. We're here, we did it. This is the tier where we actually finally have lost media, as the voiceover will say. And on top of that, it's primarily dominated by silent era movies as well. I will say, because of lost media, and I've been saying that a lot in this video, it becomes very hard to really categorize everything. And although I did my best to make an ultimate collection of Universal classic horror, unfortunately, I can't make a complete collection. I don't know if I ever will be able to make a complete collection. I would love to, but there's so much lost media and lost films and stuff that's just destroyed, lost the time that we might find, lost the time that, whatever. I make a whole speech about it in the voiceover, so I'll get to that, but I tried my best. You can consider this tier, specifically in the Iceberg, to be ongoing as more media just kind of gets found, but for now, this is what we have in the 6th tier of the Iceberg for Universal Classic Horror, and they're pretty significant, I would say. So, enjoy. Abbott and Costello Meet the Killer, Boris Karloff, 1949. An interesting collaboration of comedy duo Abbott and Costello with some Boris Karloff character. It really doesn't stand out compared to the other funnier, overall better movies. Costello was also bedridden after filming due to a relapse of rheumatoid fever, which he had battled before, but he eventually got better and began filming movies again. The Monolith Monsters, 1957. This monster film is unique in the way that the monster isn't really sentient at all, but rather a meteorite that crashed and fragmented all around the desert. When exposed to water, they essentially grow into these giant rock formations, and they have an ability to turn people into stone, metaphorical stone, I don't know. The danger of this is that every time these monolith monsters fall over and fragment again, they essentially just start spreading, until they can become essentially dangerous to humanity. This is essentially one of the first natural disaster films, more so a natural disaster from space, in the catalog of monster movies that I highly recommend because it's practically forgotten. Monster on Campus, 1958. A Jack Arnold sci-fi horror about a university professor that starts regressing into a caveman because he came into contact with irradiated fish blood, specifically a coelacanth, which was a prehistoric fish thought to be extinct and then just showed up alive one day. The Thing That Couldn't Die, 1958. A horror film that played alongside the first of Hammer horror films, Dracula, 1958, also known as Horror of Dracula. The Brute Man, 1946. Released on October 1st of 1946, this was the second film to star the Creeper played by Rondo Hatton, who, as we mentioned, died in February 2nd before he could ever see his 2 movies release. Both The Brute Man and House of Horror were filmed back-to-back prior to Hatton's death and released the same year post-death. As mentioned, Rondo's condition was unfortunate, but he will never be forgotten. Cult of Cobra, 1955. 6 American officers witness a secret ritual of worshippers of women who can turn into serpents. The snake cult notices them, essentially curses them, and a mysterious woman is around every officer who ends up dying. The Land Unknown, 1957. A CinemaScope sci-fi adventure that feels like the type of black and white dinosaur movie you could imagine. Apparently, the story of this naval expedition trapped in an Antarctic jungle is based on actual warm water found in Antarctica in 1947. This is truly a B-movie to put on, get drunk with friends, and eat popcorn while laughing at the effects. The Untamable, 1923. a silent drama about a man and his fiancée as she develops a split personality, but she's really being hypnotized by her doctor. This is one of some of the films that came out in 1923 but aren't normally recognized as often as Hunchback of Notre Dame from 1923. The Shock, 1923. Starring Lon Chaney Sr. in a movie involving a series of crimes, this silent film was loved, yet mostly forgotten today. Legally Dead, 1923. A silent drama about false convictions, execution, and resurrection. It's quite a story for a 60-minute runtime. However, this is the first mention of a lost film on this iceberg because there is no print available anywhere. Unfortunately, we may never see it. The Phantom Melody, 1920. A film predating all those in 1923 by some years, as well as including the horror of being buried alive. This 1920 silent film can be considered the first feature-length horror film Universal has ever made. But unfortunately, this title is another lost film that has not been found yet nearly 103 years after release. We also have one more title to talk about that surely changes the scope of the Universal Horror Collection in length, but The Phantom Melody is a film that carries the sad tradition of media lost to time that may never see the light of day, and as eerie as any horror film can be, the ghost of lost media haunts us worse than the chill or thrill a movie could ever deliver. There are hundreds of films, short and long, that are waiting to be resurrected for us to preserve, and equally so, there is a similar amount of films that will never be spared an eternity of rest. They are lost for good. All we can hope is that there is a search for lost media, a search that never stops, so more time capsules of what make films we love so important today can be unearthed. The Phantom Melody is lost, but because of this video, as of this video, we will never forget it. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1913. Remember, I said there was no Universal Jekyll and Hyde film prior to Abbott and Costello in the 50s. The thing is, you would not know about any Jekyll and Hyde film from Universal unless you accidentally stumbled onto it. In my research, this is a significant movie, not only because it would be a Universal Jekyll and Hyde adaptation, but because it would be the oldest Universal horror film to date, even predating the other films of this tier alone by 7 to 10 years. Most people know Dracula is the oldest Universal horror film, but it's not, if you love horror and recognize The Hunchback, but again, there are more horror films before The Hunchback in 1923, which then get dethroned by The Phantom Melody in 1920. But this movie doesn't show up in any list I've seen or any Wikipedia page or article I've scoured until I actually went out of my way to find a Universal Jekyll and Hyde film of any year, and somehow managed to find the oldest Universal monster film as of making this Iceberg video in 1913. The film was so old that it was distributed by Carl Laemmle's company IMP, which would go on to be renamed Universal Pictures. This is a 26-minute film, and it did have a re-release in 1927, and surprisingly it's not lost. You can find this on YouTube today in its entirety. I believe it's fitting that the last film on this list also happens to be the first film of the collection ever produced by a studio that turned 110 years old this year. It has yet to be in any collection I've seen distributed by Universal, but is deserving of its place in movie history, horror history, and for its 110th birthday as the first Universal horror monster. Alright, this is like a little special thing. These are essentially honorable mentions. These are not on the iceberg at all, but these are just like little movies. It's not a lot, but it's like little movies in a show that I felt was worth mentioning just because of the significance that it had at the time with certain movies in the classic Universal horror collection. Again, some of these were like produced by other production companies and stuff like that, but you know, they have some sort of like relevancy to it. I found it during my research and I thought it would be a nice addition just to have, so that's what I'm doing with this honorable mention section. Let's go to it. Island of Lost Souls, 1932. Sci-fi horror produced by Paramount Pictures but distributed by Universal Home Video Releases alongside classic monster sequels within the Universal Studios Monsters Classic Collection. The Monster and the Girl, 1941. Horror film released by Paramount Pictures and was released in the 2020 Scream Factory Universal Horror Collection alongside Captive Wild Woman, Jungle Woman, and Jungle Captive. Kuruku, Beast of the Amazon, 1956. This was a double feature with the Mole People and was an adventure monster film but was considered a disappointment. The Cat and the Canary, 1939. A remake of the 1927 silent film that was well received and well made. Dr. X, 1932. A pre-code Warner Brothers mystery horror production that was essentially remade in the Universal Night Monster of 1942. The Brides of Dracula, 1960. A Hammer-produced sequel to the 1958 Horror of Dracula by Hammer, which was a double feature with The Leech Woman from Universal in 1960. The Munsters, 1964 to 1966. This was a family-friendly sitcom about a group of monsters living in America having wacky shenanigans occur and having good moral lessons. This was a Universal production, and I include it as an honorable mention and not as a part of the Iceberg for two reasons. First, this is a show. And better yet, a show that is most definitely recognized with the likes of The Addams Family as a great companion, feel-good horror sitcom to watch. Secondly, The Munsters is a culmination of everything I talked about in this Iceberg. That is, just goes to show horror can influence and root itself into our daily lives in any means from scary to family-friendly. The Munsters needs no introduction and doesn't need to be a part of the Universal horror catalog because it is a decades-long love letter to the entire catalog after a classic era ended. It's safe to say that there is a Universal classic horror collection, and then there is The Munsters, which follows right after, and ends just before the 70s roll in and gives us a modern era of horror and color that is all classical in its own right. The Munsters is perhaps the most important honorable mention as it signifies 50 years of films leading up to its creation, giving us all the deserving tricks and treats of Universal horror. Welcome, you made it to the end of my video. I'm so glad, I'm so happy we did one whole hour and more of just talking about classic Universal horror. Why did I decide to make this video? I explained it many different times in this video, but you made it this far, so I might as well tell you. For as long as I could remember, I have always known Universal Studios. It's gonna sound corny, but while some kids were already like Disney this, Disney that, to me, Disney was just a name for movies. It really had nothing to do with like making movies or animated movies, but an impressionable young kid as I was, I did recognize Universal Studios because I was like, they make movies. They make movies. An impressionable kid watched Jaws, which was the first movie that I can actually recognize and be like, I like this movie a lot, and I want to make movies because I saw this movie made by this company. And as I get older, I start to watch more Universal media, but it also happens to be that I live in Florida, and I have lived in Florida all my life until I eventually moved to Atlanta at some point. Florida has one of only 2 Universal studios in the whole nation. When we're talking country, there's more, but we're talking in the nation. So what are the odds that a kid that recognizes Universal Studios as a place that makes movies, likes a movie, Jaws, watches more of Universal Studio movies, and then realizes that there's also a Universal Studios theme park, whatever, in the same state that he lives just a couple hours away? Yeah, Universal Studios was fairly significant in my life growing up from a very young age. And as you can tell, it influenced a lot of things. For the same reasons that Disney is synonymous with animation, I believe that Universal Studios is synonymous with horror, and they do it well, and they've done it right for many years. Sure, maybe they've had movies that really aren't that good. I mean, that's pretty much every studio, but when I think Universal Studios, I think horror. Even most recently, one of my favorite horror movies from them is Jordan Peele's Nope, and that's essentially an homage to Jaws, which I made a video about. And then there's Jaws, and before Jaws, there was underwater monsters like Creature from the Black Lagoon, and before that, there was Dracula and Frankenstein, and the whole collaboration of this universe of monsters and horror's significance and basically creating the film industry as we know it today. And yeah, Universal's some company, corporate conglomerate that couldn't give a, I'm trying not to curse, but couldn't give a shit as to who I am. However, to me, Universal Studios still remains, the studio I think of when I think of movies and especially horror movies. Whether it's a small little killer doll like Chucky or a big shark or a different underwater creature like a black and white creature, Universal is very important, and I feel like the legacy of its classic horror collection is pretty well represented in this video that I've been wanting to make for such a long time because there's just so much to Universal and Universal's horror. And I feel like maybe one day, it probably won't happen anytime soon, but maybe one day they'll actually have a collection that kind of encompasses all of these movies. I highly, highly doubt it, but that would be a dream, would be to have like a 90 movie set of just like the monsters and the lesser known monsters and the lost films that, you know, were discovered and stuff like that. Regardless of what my dreams are, this video is definitely just a love letter to Universal Horror and everything that the monsters and sci-fi and thrillers and crime dramas and mysteries and all those things had to do over decades and decades of Universal existence, essentially. When Carl Laemmle made IMP, which eventually was turned into Universal Studios, it kind of spawned all of this, and I'm actually really glad that doing all this research has kind of led me to find stuff that I honestly didn't even know about, like Jekyll and Hyde 1913. And I'm glad that everybody stuck around for this Iceberg video where I get to dress up like a silly little guy and have like flashing lightning and little sound effects like bows and lightning and whatnot. And although this video might just get 30 views in the span of 2 weeks, you know, happy Halloween. And, you know, thank you guys for watching. I will be back on YouTube more often, more frequently. Life has been crazy, and I'm very glad that this is one of my first major videos coming back, because, I mean, you know, it's been a couple months, and I feel like this is a couple months worth of content all turned into one video. So, you guys deserve it. I'm glad to have made it. You know, I'll be back. I'll be here. I'll return for my revenge from the lagoon of the castle of the undead. Anyways, I haven't decided if I'm going to edit this video in black and white in certain portions or whatever, but this is how I'm going to end the video. This is a Killer Clown's laser gun. Bye, y'all. I will see you in the next video.